like Topsy, it grew. I still am astonished how many people read it. And there'll be calls from all over. Governor Bates' great-great-grandson, who lives in Hawaii, called me from Hawaii. Some young lady from Dartmouth, New Hampshire, had called me, and at 5 production companies. So it gets around. The word history comes from the Greek word historian, which means inquiry. And I think it was Confucius who said that, I want to get my quote right, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And there's that famous quote that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I want to thank Mr. Hunley for giving me the opportunity to write for the Focus. The only disagreement we ever had was over money. He wanted to pay, I would not, because I wanted the ability to say whatever I wanted to. So, and I've pretty much done that. But I appreciate that very much. I'm glad you invited me, David, and thank you. The 4 Tennesseans who served the longest in Congress from Tennessee, there were 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The first is Kenneth McKellar, who served 36 years in the Senate and 6 years in the Congress. Nobody from Tennessee has ever served that long. Probably nobody ever will again. And there was Carroll Reese from Upper East Tennessee, who served 34 years. Carroll was one of those who would come back because his service was not continuous. His successor, Jimmy Quillen, also served 34 years continuously. Then there was Albert Gore Sr. Now, to give you an idea of how long McKellar was there, Marcia Blackburn would have to be 102 to serve the same length of service. Bill Haggerty would have to be 97. And Carroll Reese was an interesting sort. You all have seen some of those columns. He was actually a genuine war hero. And Carroll ended up he was the Republican National Chairman at one point in time. And he left Congress to do that. And then he ran for the Senate in 1948, the first Republican to make a serious bid for the United States Senate when Tennessee was distinctly not a Republican state. Then 2 years later, he came back and beat the incumbent that had succeeded him to reclaim his seat in Congress, where he stayed until he died 10 years later. Now, keep in mind, back then, there was no safety net. In fact, most folks did not have pensions. And the only way that you had a pension was when your congressman would introduce a special bill on your behalf. And Reese liked to brag, being a veteran, that he had sponsored more of those than any other member of Congress, which is probably true, which is probably why he kept being elected again and again and again. It was Senator McKellar who started the constituent service that Tennesseans are so used to. You know, we've had some colorful politicians from Tennessee, but he set the standard for constituent service, which was emulated by both Duncans, Carroll Reese, Jimmy Quillen, and that standard still exists today. And when Carroll came home, he had actually worked his way through school, put himself through school. He was one of 14 children. And then he became an economist. He graduated from the University of New York and then came home to run for Congress and beat an incumbent who was fairly well entrenched in the Republican primary. McKellar was a bachelor from Memphis. And the revisionists like to say he was part of the Crump machine. No, he really wasn't. Mr. Crump was his personal friend. And they had an organization that Senator McKellar, really, his influence was statewide, while Crump's was confined to Memphis. And he had been a very successful lawyer before he came to Congress. And he was on vacation when Congressman George Washington Gordon, who was the incumbent, suddenly died. And he was on the golf course, and his brother had wired him and said, you know, we're ready to file you for Congress. And McKellar wired back, just 2 words, not interested. Well, his opponent was a guy who proved to be the aptly named Tom Looney, who said that McKellar was afraid to run against him. So that's when Senator McKellar filed and beat the hell out of Tom Looney. He was in Congress from 1911 to 1953. He had an amazing ability to produce projects and jobs for Tennesseans. And the most famous story where this column originated was Lamar used to tell this story, Senator Baker used to tell this story about how we got Oak Ridge. And McKellar was very acquisitive. And he was the acting chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, through which every federal dollar spent by the federal government goes. So, President Roosevelt called McKellar to the White House and he said, Senator, can you hide $2 billion in the budget? And now I heard this story actually not from one of them, but from McKellar's last administrative assistant, W.R. Davidson, whose name was Woodrow W.R. Davidson. But McKellar leaned forward and he said, well, of course I can, Mr. President, but where in Tennessee are we going to hide it? And he hid it at Oak Ridge. That's where it was. So he was hiding things, in Tennessee all over. At once, McKellar was a rare senator who could legislate as well as do his constituent work as well. But once while he was speaking, the majority leader, Scott Lucas of Illinois, dared to yawn while he was speaking. And McKellar protested to the vice president who was presiding that the senator from Illinois had yawned while he was speaking. Well, Alvin Barkley was the vice president. He paused for a minute and he said, the yawn from the senator from Illinois will be stricken from the record. So that managed to pacify him. The Walter Chandler, this is how deep McKellar's constituent surface, it gives you an idea of how deep down into the constituency it went. Walter Chandler was the mayor of Memphis for a long time. He was a congressman from Memphis. But like many Tennesseans of the period, like Carroll Reese, Gordon Browning, he was a veteran of the First World War. And Chandler recalled when somebody was getting ready to run against McKellar one time, he said he can't be beat. And he said, while I was a captain in the First World War, while our troops were training before they left the United States of America, and after we were in France, I would get a letter from Senator McKellar just about every week. And I've copied down what the substance of what that letter would say. Dear Captain Chandler, Private John Smith's mother informs me that she has not had a letter from him in more than 3 weeks. Please have Private Smith write his mother at once. Very truly yours, Kenneth McKellar. And he would write back that the offending private or serviceman who had not written his mother had done so and promised to be a better correspondent in the future. One of McKellar's closest friends in the Senate was a little bantam rooster of a fellow named Carter Glass, who was very peppery in his personality, who was a very diminutive fellow. And President Roosevelt called him an reconstructed rebel. And he was notorious for opposing the New Deal, although he was a Democrat. And once FDR had him come with him to the dedication of something in Roanoke, Virginia. So they were riding in the same car. And FDR looked at him and said, Carter, for once I have you going along with me. And Carter Glass replied, yes, Franklin, for once you're going in the right direction. They were headed south. So that was that. Judah Benjamin, he was one of the first Jewish senators, one of the first senators to be of the Jewish faith. He represented Louisiana in the Senate. And one of his colleagues attacked him for his faith, which kind of is, a thing going on today. And Judah Benjamin said, it is true, I'm a Jew. And when my ancestors were receiving their 10 commandments from the immediate hand of the deity, the ancestors of the distinguished gentleman who is opposed to me were herding swine in the forests of Scandinavia. Alexander Stephens of Georgia was also a very diminutive man. He was a remarkable orator, was the vice president of the Confederacy at one time. And in the heat of a debate, he said that my opponent is not fit to carry swill to a swine. Well, that's against the rules of the Senate, so he got called to order. And Stephens was required to give an apology, and he said, Mr. Speaker, I do apologize. The senator is absolutely fit for the duty to which I referred. That was his apology. There was a congressman from West Virginia who always insisted his opinions were very humble, but his speeches were not so short. And once he drew the attention of old Thaddeus Stevens, the fire-eating congressman from Pennsylvania, and he wanted the floor. And Thaddeus Stevens said, I now yield to my honorable colleague who will now make a few feeble remarks. Cordell Hull is the longest serving Secretary of State in our country's history. He was from Tennessee. He was a congressman and a senator from Tennessee. But he was extremely well known for being cautious. As blunt as McKellar was, who, if you sent McKellar a nasty letter, you got one right back. But Cordell Hull was very, very cautious. He was known for being very cautious, politically speaking. He was riding on a train with James A. Farley, President Roosevelt's Postmaster General and patronage distributor. And they were coming back from Tennessee. And Farley pointed, he said, look at those sheep over there on that hill. Oh, look. He said, they're shorn. They've been sheared. Hull looks and he said, well, at least on that side. So there was Senator John Knight Shields, who was a Democrat from East Tennessee. He was a curmudgeonly sort. He is the last senator from Tennessee to be elected by the legislature. And he was elected by a combine of independent Democrats and Republicans. And he had to run for the first time in 1918, and he ran against the governor. He was a crotchety, curmudgeon old fellow, and he had called Senator McKellar one night saying he was dying. And he was very sick, very ill in his hotel. And they called the hotel doctor, and the doctor discerned, he said, you're being poisoned by your teeth. Senator Shields reached his mouth, pulled out his dentures, put them on the bedside. He said, am I well? So, in 1950, in the decade of the 50s, there was two senators from Tennessee, both Democrats, named Albert Gore Sr., the father of the former vice president, and Estes Kefauver. Now, they were Democrats of a different stripe. They were a little more on the liberal side. And one night, and Albert Gore Jr. told this story at his father's funeral, how in the middle of the night, one night, the phone rings and Senator Gore answers the phone, and it was an irate constituent who probably had a little bit too much to drink. And he said, Albert, you just need to take care of the white people. And Senator Gore didn't say anything. He said, he said some ugly things. I don't want to go to school with him. I don't want to eat with him. And Gore said very softly, would you like to go to heaven with him? And he said, he just got quiet for a minute. He said, no, I guess I'll go to hell with you and Estes. So there are all kinds of stories about Calvin Coolidge, who was not a man of many words. And George Moses was a senator from New Hampshire. He was a stalwart, a conservative Republican. He stormed into Coolidge's office one day to say that a particular candidate for the Senate was an SOB, a low-down SOB. And Coolidge sat back and he said that could be, but there are a great many of those in the country, and I think they're probably due to be represented in the Senate as well. So, Donald Trump's not the only president to have been mistreated by the press. Lyndon Johnson did not like the press that he got, and he illustrated the problem perfectly. He said, if one morning I walked on top of the water across the Potomac River, the afternoon newspaper headline would be, President Can't Swim. There was an old Republican who was interviewed on his 98th birthday, and the reporter said, you've lived a long time and seen many changes, and he said, yes, and I was against every damned one of them. I really appreciate you all having me. And I want to leave you with a quote from the most historical book of all, the Bible. And it's from the book of Numbers, verses 24 through 26. May the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. That's my prayer for each one of you. Thank you and good night.